If you'd like to follow along with the scripture reading, it'll be from Acts chapter 18, verses 1 through 3. Acts 18, 1 through 3. After these things, Paul departed from Athens and went to Corinth. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had commanded all the Jews to depart from Rome. And he came to them. So because he was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked. For by occupation they were tent makers.
Hello? Working?
Good? Okay. I remember when I was in high school, I had decided that I wanted to go to school at UT Knoxville, and I wanted to be a lawyer. And so I wrote that down on my list of things to do, and then my senior year, a couple things happened, and I just had a burning passion for God, and I needed to preach. And my parents hated to break it to me because we're UT fans, but Knoxville does not train people for ministry. So I was going to have to pick another college. And at that point, I said, well, let's just start looking. And so we went through a search and ended up going on a completely different path than I thought I was going to go on. And so in many ways, that has typified the journey that I've been on, where in many ways I feel like doors have opened up for me to do ministry for the Lord. And it's something that I've always felt compelled to do, something I've always wanted to do, but I've never actually known exactly how to proceed forward in doing that. You know, I would make these plans and then different things would happen. I remember, let's fast forward to the year, I guess it was 2002, and I had been in home construction for 2 years in order to pay bills while I was in school. But I loved it, still love it. And so I'm doing all of this construction, trying to go to school when I can, and basically you're able to whittle down the amount of time you sleep to about 3 or 4 hours, and then you sort of halfway function the rest of the time and to do what you need to do. And every month, Robin and I would try to go visit either her parents or my parents because we wanted to stay close with family and still believe in that. And so we decided to go visit my parents for the weekend. And we came down, and my dad wanted me to catch him up on everything we'd been doing. And so we were talking, and Sunday morning came around. We went to church with them, and Sunday afternoon we ate lunch with them. We were going to eat lunch and then get on the road and get back home, which was a couple hours away. Well, the afternoon got away from us. We were enjoying just talking and having a good time, and one of the conversations that we had was a very important conversation. I'm telling my dad about how the construction's going, and I've gone from working with another guy to contracting, which is a whole other beast. The main difference between the two is one of them pays you, and then when you contract, you may get paid and you may not get paid because all of a sudden you're your own boss. And so I was fussing about this, that, and the other, because I was trying to do this and that and just telling my dad all about it. And my dad said to me, he's a very practical man, he said, Jeremy, he said, are you wanting to preach still? And I was working with a little church and said, yeah, I want to preach. He said, and you want to build houses, right? I said, yeah, I want to build houses. He said, son, you're going to have to decide what you want to do. I said, what do you mean? He says, you can't do everything. You got to pick what you're going to do. And so I thought about that for a minute because I had the energy of a 22-year-old, and I thought, no, I can do everything at the time. But at the same time, I was hearing wisdom, and I knew I was hearing it, and I was thinking, well, maybe I'm just going to have to decide, because I can't do it all. And so I thought about it, and I didn't actually articulate any of my thoughts. I just kind of stuck it in there, and I thought about it, and we kept talking. Well, the interesting thing to me is while we were sitting there, I said to myself and not to him, I said, well, this is a no-brainer. I have to pay the bills and I'll do that, but I want to preach. That's my passion. That's what I want to do. But I didn't tell him that. And so we kept talking. Well, guess what? We looked down at the clock. It was like 4 o'clock. And we're like, Robert, we are not going to be able to get home. My dad says, well, why don't y'all just come with us? I said, sure, where are y'all going? I mean, and my dad visits like 100 churches a year, so, it's just a coin toss on, where we're going to go that night. And he says, well, we're going to be headed out to North Carolina, not the state, the congregation. And y'all can just come along there with us if you want to. Sure, we'll go with you. Well, we didn't even bring the clothes and we all that kind of stuff. And so, but still, we can't make it home. So we get in the car with them. We ride out there. It just so happens that I was going to be graduating with a master's degree in about 3 months from when we were there. He does his report. We listen to the report. We get done. We're just talking to people. And then all of a sudden, I realize I'm in this very strange situation. I'm standing here. Just about everybody's gone at this point. We're just standing in the middle of the parking lot. I don't know if y'all know this, but this is where most church business takes place. It's in a parking lot, and the business happened, and you didn't know it just happened if you're not paying attention. Well, this was one of those. I'm standing there. My dad's standing right here. There's an elder standing right here and an elder standing right here. And this elder looks at my dad and says, well, Wayne, the day's come. We're finally able to go in with both feet with you. For 10 years, they've been saying, not this year, Wayne, not this year. They've been helping him a little bit, but this year something had changed in the budget. We can jump in. And the other elder says, yep, that's the case. What can we do, Wayne? How can we get involved? My dad goes, he's graduating in 2 months. And when he does that, his finger's going right here. Do you understand what I'm saying? And then they look at me and they go, and then, a month later, I'm in North Carolina in an interview, and we're talking about the details. And I'm sitting there going, what? I didn't tell you, Daddy, that I want to preach. I didn't tell you. I told you about my troubles with contracting. You see what I'm saying? And then you start going, wait a minute, because I'm not one of those kind of guys. I'm a skeptical kind of a person. If you start telling me about the providence of God, I'm going to go, But then all of a sudden things happen in your life and you're going, wait a minute now. How did this fall into place? Well, I'm telling you this, and we can make all kinds of applications out of this if we want to. The direction of this chapel talk is not the providence of God. This chapel talk is about vocational ministry. Okay? And I wanted to try to help you experience some of the things that I experienced in the path that you went down. And all of a sudden, what you're going to realize as you get into ministry is that there are going to be strengths and weaknesses to how you approach it. And at the time I was sitting there with my dad, what I was experiencing was one of the difficulties that is not uncommon to vocational ministry, and that is you don't have the time to do what you want to do in ministry because you're having to take the time to do what you have to do. You see what I'm saying? All of these things that need to be done with contracting were leading me down this path that weren't allowing me to do what I was passionate about. Now, one thing that was interesting to me was Travis gave us the flip side of the coin, and so we talked about this with the Master of Divinity students, and one of the things Travis said was the strength of full-time ministry. Travis and I didn't talk about this. This is what makes this fun. He said that you get to spend time in the Word, and you get to spend time in visiting people. Well, one of the full-time guys that I talked to, he says, well, that's not true. I don't have enough time for the Word, and I don't have enough time to visit because I'm too busy running the church. So what am I about to tell you? One of the benefits of vocational ministry is you don't have to run a church. Okay, that's just one. What do you mean by run a church? Well, in the 21st century, we have buildings that have lights, and they have pews, and they have carpets, and they have kids that spill milk on them, and somebody's got to be the coordinator to do all of that stuff. And oftentimes it ends up being you. Well, what are the strengths of vocational ministry? I'll give you some strengths, and I'll give you a few weaknesses. And I'm sure you could think of a few other ones in addition to what I'm going to give you. But I'm going to give you just some of the practical pros and cons, and then I'll give you a little bit of scripture, and then we'll just tie this up with a ribbon and be done with it, okay? Well, number one, You can go where you want. Ministers who are financially tied to ministry can stay in an area longer than their passion does. When you're a vocational ministry, one of the strengths is you kind of get to define the terms on how you want to get involved. You know, nobody's defining them for you. And so you kind of get to go in the way you want to go into it. On top of that, if you're in vocational ministry, so to speak, you get to live the way you want to live. You're not living in that glass house that people talk about. You just kind of do what you want to do and approach it the way that you want to approach it. Nobody's going to be criticizing you. Those members at your congregation with the big pocketbooks and a lot of finances can't tell you how to do this or that, and all of a sudden you feel just free from all those different types of things. And that gives you a different sense of peace. You don't have to make people happy either. You don't have to try to please them because they want this or that. You just kind of approach it however you want to. There's just sort of a thread running through all of this. What is it? It's called independence. Independence is one of the things that you get. Not only that, but if you're a vocational minister, another one of the benefits is that you sometimes will have greater influence outside of your church community, which means you may have more mission contacts, so to speak. People, you'll put a face on that church that will be a blessing. You see, there are very good benefits that you could have. And it can be very rewarding too. Whatever ministry you say you have time for will be very rewarding because you get to define it. But that actually kind of tips us off onto the other side, the weaknesses. Now you notice how I said that ministry, singular, that you get to be involved in will be very rewarding? And the reason I say that is because if you're in vocational ministry, you don't have time to get involved in the ministries of the church. You're going to have to look at everything that the church does, and you'll have about enough time to do one of them. And you'll barely have enough time to do that. You know, I deal with people constantly who are in vocational ministry. It's not like they just sat down and said, should I be a minister or a vocational minister? They're active members of the church, but basically they've got Sunday afternoon to devote to ministries of the church. That doesn't mean they're not Christians from 9 to 5, but what that means is they go and they do their job and they do what they have to do, and it doesn't leave them a whole lot of time in order to be able to devote to just purely giving it to the Lord. And that's one of the weaknesses. You've only got just enough time to do anything with it. You see what I'm saying? So that's one of the weaknesses and that you'll have to deal with. And the reason that's so important to you is because if you're at a school like this one, this suggests to me that you want to devote a lot of time towards ministry, which means you may find yourself feeling very unrewarded in life if you're not able to throw yourself into it. Another weakness of vocational ministry is, you may get to define that ministry the way you want it, but you don't actually have the time to put into it, and you don't get to define the parameters of it. All of a sudden, these great, important, pressing matters, maybe you've been working with certain people and you've become important in their life and they trust you and you're trying to lead them to Christ. And then let's say these people that you've come to trust and they trust you and you're trying to lead them to Christ, they have a crisis in your life, and the crisis just seems to perfectly line up with your 1 week business vacation. Your 1 week business trip, not a vacation. And you have to be out of town. You can't cut it so that you can minister. You see what I'm saying? You've got to go do what you have to go do. And your boss doesn't care about the relationship you've developed with these people. You know, I received an email from a guy the other day who is in full-time ministry, and we're supposed to go eat lunch together. Well, I get a last-minute email, and guess what it says? Love to eat lunch today, but we need to do it next week. So-and-so passed away. I've got to go spend some time with him. Why can he do that? Because he's a minister. You see what I'm saying? He's given himself to that, and that's what he does. If it was vocational ministry, he'd probably still have to go to work. And he might be able to find some time at the end of the day to do that. Not only that, here's a big one that people oftentimes, you know how I talked about if you're in vocational ministry, you'll have a stronger reputation with your community outside the church? Well, that also correlates the other way. You have a smaller reputation inside the church. It's not that people think of you less, it's just they don't take you as seriously. I'll give you another example talking about fundraising for mission work. My dad noticed a trend. He noticed that people who were associated with our Christian colleges end up having higher levels of success in ministry than those who were not. Why? Because it showed that they were both feet in. They were committed to it. And when you're in vocational ministry, what ends up happening? Well, you come to a certain situation and professionally you've given your life to this over here, business, blah, blah, blah. You know what that says to people? Oh, your church stuff is your hobby. It's just your hobby. It's not your passion. It's not your soul. And so people end up taking you less seriously because they think you're dealing with it like it's a hobby. You see what I'm saying? So that's just something that you need to take into consideration too. So, am I trying to tell you to do one or the other? No, not really. Probably the most assertive thing that I said is the fact that you're here probably means that you ought to go into full-time ministry. Because you may not be satisfied otherwise. But let me give you a little bit of scripture to help you sort of parse this out just a little bit more, to help you think about the way you want to approach your life and your ministry. And it's the passage that we looked at. It's in Acts chapter 18. And I want us to look at Paul. This is sort of our scriptural grounding for the issue that we're dealing with here. And one of the reasons why I like to look at Paul is because we see a man who found himself doing both at different times. It wasn't like he made a decision to always be a vocational minister. And it wasn't like he always did full-time ministry. We know from Paul's background that he actually received a full-time training to do full-time work, studying at the feet of Gamaliel. It just so happened that he had this pretty significant conversion on the road to Damascus, and all of those paying gigs for Gamaliel-trained people all of a sudden dried up. You see what I'm saying? So here you have a guy who had trained to do this in his Jewish walk, and all of a sudden he proclaims Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and there's not that many people who need His services now. So at that point, he relies a little bit on his tent making. And when you read this passage right here in Acts 18, it says, "After these things, Paul departed from Athens and came to Corinth, and found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome, and came unto them. And because he was of the same craft, he abode with them, and wrought," he worked. "For by their occupation they were tent makers." Now, I like this occupation that they're dealing with here. Tent making is, the word there for tent could also be translated like a temporary shelter. So, or in what we're thinking of, it could have been either tents for people to live in, but more likely it may have been marketplace businesses. People who go to the marketplace, they just have a little awning set up. Or it could have been making awnings for people's businesses who had brick and mortar type construction and they needed something to block the shade. These are some of the types of things that Paul may have been involved in. It's also possible, too, that Paul was a prop maker. The word for tent maker sometimes is translated as one who makes props. And we're talking about little street corner theater. You know, just a real cheaply made little prop, you know, where they're going to put on a little play and they need a little stage. So Paul was sort of just a little jack of all trades, maybe a handyman of sorts. And this is what he did in order to get by. It's day labor, what we're talking about here. But one of the reasons why we see Paul participating in day labor is not because he sat down and just made a decision that he didn't want to do full-time ministry. Because what you need to understand about Paul is when we read texts like Galatians chapter 1, where Paul talks about being called, separated from his mother's womb to ministry. It's not like Paul felt like he had a choice in it. He felt compelled to do it. Oftentimes imagine Paul feeling like he's being grabbed by the shirt collar and yanked along. But the compulsion that he has is one that many of us identify with. Okay? And so when we see Paul tent making, you know what it really meant? It meant that the funds that he had to get him that far had dried up, and he needed to eat. Okay? If you start looking at Paul's ministries, and you start thinking about how he would plan them out, from his first missionary journey, he and Barnabas made a distance that was reasonable, where they could go and they could come back, and they could probably carry all of the gold that they needed to pay for it. On this one, though, he goes where he thinks his ministry will go, which is up to Troas. He goes that far. And at that point, he thought he was supposed to start heading home, the text says. But God had something else in mind, didn't He? God says, you're going to Macedonia, which is crossing the water and going further to the west. In fact, this is the first time that we read about missionaries going from Asia into Europe, from east to west. And Paul crosses over, and amazingly enough, Paul has the most successful ministry of his entire career during this one campaign. I mean, if you want to narrow down the good of Paul, it's this one season of ministry, one summer. You see what I'm saying? And he goes up to Philippi and he preaches, and it's awesome. He goes on to Thessalonica, amazing. In fact, it's so amazing he gets run out of town. He goes down to Athens. Athens, complete flop. Complete flop. And from there he goes on over to Corinth. And when he was down there at Athens, he wasn't just there preaching, but he was actually waiting for his co-workers who were up in Thessalonica to finish things up so they could come join him. And I bet that they had all the coin that he needed with them. And he needed to eat. And he started working. You see what I'm saying? And it doesn't take long. They work for a while. The ministry grows. And then he finally takes a ship and he gets back to the Holy Lands. And then he does it again. So, what am I getting at? There's two things here. I've done vocational ministry. I've done full-time ministry. Paul did both. I've never sat down at any point in my life and said, I will be a vocational minister or I will be a full-time minister. You see what I'm saying? You just need to kind of realize the different types of situations you're going to end up in. But the truth of it is if you feel compelled to minister for God, you will minister for God. And you will pay the bills however the bills need to be paid. And at some point you'll look back and you go, oh, I was a vocational minister then. And at other times you'll go, oh, I was a full-time minister. So what do you need to do out of all this? You need to weigh out where your heart is and what you feel compelled to do and what you want to do with your life. The ministry, how important it is to you. Your compassion for people. Your compassion for others. And how you want to interact with them, how you want to get involved in that and help them. And your desire to study Scripture. Are you passionate about it? You see? That's what you need to be weighing out. And then as you move forward, what I want you to realize is when you sit down and you realize that most of your bills are being paid, for instance, by a church, then it's going to bring a whole different set of situations that need to be thought about. However, if most of your bills are being paid by your job, it's going to create a whole different type of scenario that you're going to have to think about. And if you're aware of the two, it's going to help you to navigate through them more easily. Well, I'll leave you this lesson with that right there, and I hope that it'll be encouraging to you. I would like to just give you an opportunity to comment or ask questions or any thoughts. We have about 30 seconds. If anybody would like to do that, add any reflections.
Dr.
Mm-hmm.
This is trivial, but have you ever heard someone talk about that tent making in that day and time could have been something akin to leather working with leather?
Yes.
Like tanning, like Simon the Tanner, people like that?
Yeah, I've heard that. I think that what Paul would have been doing, this is just me talking, I think it would have been the next step down. When the tanner was done with it, then Paul's the one who gets it and starts punching holes in it and tying leather ropes to it, and, you know, kind of like one person sells the material to make clothes and the next person actually fashions the clothes. So that would be the way I would see the two as related. Anybody else? Good thoughts. Excellent.
I prefer to think that he was a home builder.
Right.
But you know, when we talk about a carpenter,
Mm-hmm.
isn't it more correct that a carpenter was actually a builder?
Mm-hmm.
Used more stone and masonry type
Mm-hmm.
items than he actually did wood?
Yeah, it's possible.
Archaeology shows that, you know, there's
Yeah.
so many stone-built
Right.
structures.
Right. And that's probably the case, you know. I mean, you know, one of the difficulties is I think of 2x4s, you know, the types of carpentry that we deal with today. And it would have been quite a different type of, the techniques and tools would have been so different, you know, from what we're used to dealing with. Go ahead, to grow on, last comment.
Well, I had a question more of when you're in your ministry, you're in vocation, say you're doing a vocational ministry, and then you start thinking, you know, like, when is it like the work you can see is struggling? Like, you know, how is it that you turn to vocational ministry and then you're looking at your ministry and you're saying, wow, this is really struggling. I'm sure that happens more times than we'd like to admit.
It does.
All focus in it.
It does, because sometimes you'll sit down and you'll say, you know what? This little project or this congregation is going to make it. But in order to make it, it's going to need this, 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 and this. And then you say, let's see, we need this many dollars, we need this many people, I need to put in this many hours. And then it occurs to you, oh, that's about 4 times the number of hours required to do this than I have. And all of a sudden, you just realized, oh, I need to be in full-time ministry, because I can't make this project succeed unless we give it more, and I can't figure out how to do it, you know, based on what I'm doing now. So, I mean, people go through it all the time. You know, I saw a guy who dealt with that, and he switched on over. He quit that job, and he went straight into full-time ministry, and he's been in it ever since, because he realized he couldn't do what he wanted to do with the margins. That's all he had to work with. Well, we're over time. I appreciate it.